The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of KSMQ Public Service Media Incorporated or its assigns.
Welcome to Garden Connections. I'm your host, Stephanie Passingham. Well, today we're spending all day at Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa, and I think you're really going to love this show. We're going to talk with Diane Otwaley, and she is the co-founder of this organization, and she's going to talk about the vision and then how they're fulfilling that vision and mission here in Decorah. We'll also get a chance to talk to Laura Merrick, and she's from Iowa State University. She is a squash specialist. And of course, Chef Stephen Larson with a great recipe. I hope you'll stay with us. Garden Connections is coming up next. Well, we're here at the Seed Savers Exchange, and we're with co-founder Diane Otwaley. Diane, this is an amazing place.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for coming here to visit today.
Well, I love this place, and I really wanted to help people understand kind of where this idea came from, because we hear a lot about seed saving, and it's a little bit more popular now than it used to be, or at least we think. But tell us, where did this idea, this concept come from?
Well, the idea for Seed Savers came about. We're a nonprofit organization working with preservation of heirloom varieties of fruits, vegetables, flowers, and herbs. And now you do hear heirloom used a lot in the mainstream vocabulary. But when we started with a true heirloom in my mind, and that was from my grandparents, my great-grandparents actually. When I was growing up, I grew up on a dairy farm about 20 miles from here, and part of my childhood memory was going down to visit my grandparents. And we would go down, usually after my dad was finished with the milking, and we would go down to visit them, but mainly in the summer I remember our garden walks, because the gardens were so important to my grandparents, because later on I realized that my grandmother's grocery list consisted of flour, sugar, vinegar, coffee, salt, and spices, and everything else that they raised from their farm, from their gardens and their land, and from their hands. So garden was a measure of their success, and then also was going to be sustaining their family of 9 children during the winter. 9 children, very important. 9 children, yes, during the Depression. And so I'd always sensed that the gardens were a special place. But we would end the garden walks on my grandparents' porch, and they'd have morning glories. They're growing along the barn here. And we would sit on the porch, and he'd always have an opening. It'd either be a square or a triangle or a circle, so we could sit in this little cozy morning glory room and watch cars go by. And he'd have stories about, they're late for milking, or they never stay home, and that's the second time she's been out today. And, so it was just a real, just a wonderful memory of my grandparents. So when I had my first garden, Kent Whaley and I were newly married and lived about 5 miles from my grandparents, and we of course hit one at the Morning Glories. So we went over.
Very signature item for you.
Yes, yeah, and I asked my grandfather for some seeds, and he went back into the bedroom and he came out with this little white pillbox full of these tiny little black seeds. And he said, "Did you know my parents brought this seed over from Bavaria when they immigrated?"
Oh, is that right?
During the turn of the century. And I had never known that story, but realizing that I was holding a living link back to ancestors that I had never known or thought about was quite a powerful experience for me. And then unfortunately later that winter my grandfather passed away. And we realized if he hadn't given us those seeds and the story that went with it, they would have been lost. And how often that might happen when immigrants would come into this country, they bring with them their seeds.
Seed Savers Exchange does many activities throughout the year in support of that mission, and we got a chance to talk to Laura Merrick, who is a squash specialist, and she came out during one of your many festivals that you guys do. So we're going to take a break and visit with Laura. When we come back, we'll be visiting more with Diane in Diane's garden. Let's check out some squash. are here on top of the hill at Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa, and it's a very windy day. That's kind of what happens on top of the ridge, but we've got our specialist in squash with us, and it's Laura Merrick from Iowa State University. Thanks for being part of the program, Laura.
You're welcome.
So, you are a specialist in squash. What made you pick squash?
I went to graduate school with an idea of studying crop evolution, and it happened that there was a conference going on in the first week that I got there that was all about what is known as the Cucurbitaceae, the whole family of vining crops, of which squash is one.
Okay, so that piqued your interest right from the get-go.
Yeah, I went to graduate school in plant taxonomy. That means I was studying the relationships among plants. And so I was focusing on ancestral types of squash. I mostly worked in Mexico, actually.
Oh, wow. Cool. Now, how long has squash been with us as a plant, and one that I would say that we eat?
Squash happens to be one of the earliest domesticated plants in the Americas. So all the squash and pumpkins and little ornamental gourds that are related all came from the Americas, some of them from South America, some from Central America, Mexico, even southern United States.
Okay.
So it definitely was selected early to be a crop plant that people planted and consumed.
Okay. Now, you mentioned southern North America, Central America. Is this a plant that especially loves hot weather? Or, you know, we're here in Iowa, which is a northern climate, and if you look around, you can see squash does really well here.
Yeah, actually, the type of squash that you're holding in your hands, which is what we call an heirloom type, the family is known who cultivated this variety, although I don't know where the family was from. This plant actually is known as Cucurbita maxima, and it was a squash that was domesticated in South America, sometimes high in the Andes.
Okay.
Some were from lowland, but a lot of what we call the maxima type of squashes, like this one, are definitely have some cold tolerance.
Okay.
And so in this field, we're mostly looking at what we call winter squash. That means a squash that is consumed as a mature fruit. So you really want full season.
Right, so you want a nice long season to get...
Yeah, and so we can see from looking at the patch that this came from, had really good production under the conditions
they have
high
up
on
here.
this hill,
The wind
lots
and the
of sun
sunshine.
exposure.
Yeah. So now you mentioned winter squash, and then there's summer squash. Are those essentially the same plants, or what's the difference between them? And is it, you mentioned a function of letting winter squash mature. Give us some sense of the difference between them.
Yeah, in the U.S., we use those terms a fair amount. So the winter squash, as I said, we usually let those get fully mature. What we call a summer squash, relative of those are zucchinis, but we have crooknecks and straight necks. And those are harvested as an immature fruit.
Okay.
So often not very many days after a flower has opened, when it's the ideal when those plants are quite, the fruit is quite small. So gardeners sometimes let zucchinis get away from them.
Right, or you don't see them under all that foliage and they get giant.
And so that's least desirable unless you want to smash them up and use them for making zucchini bread.
Okay. Now, if you were to leave those summer squash to mature like you do these winter squash, is it a taste issue that they wouldn't taste as good? The flesh isn't as sweet? Is that why we don't eat them older? And
some of it is a taste issue, but there are actually traits of some summer squash which make them highly undesirable to let them get fully mature.
Okay.
And the ones, the yellow, what we call the yellow crookneck or the yellow straight type of summer squash, those actually carry a gene, a trait for their rind that makes them hard as a rock.
Okay, so you couldn't
when
really
they're
eat them
fully
anyway.
mature, and so obviously that's not a trait that you would want to have to deal with when
Right.
you're,
When you're
getting
looking for
ready
food.
to eat. Yeah.
All right, well, up here on the hill, they clearly have lots of sunshine. I noticed that they've also put down some black plastic. Is that key in the cultivation of either a winter or a summer squash?
Well, you can see that I think pretty much all of the varieties that they have in this patch are vining types.
As opposed to bush type.
Yeah, bush type just means, technically it means short internodes, so really short branches.
Okay.
And these vining types are large plants. So the black plastic, one feature of it is it helps you control weeds under the plants. But the major reason why gardeners like to use it, and places like Seed Savers who have these large grow outs, is the black plastic heats the soil up an extra amount, and squashes, whether they're summer or winter squashes, tend to really be heat loving.
Okay. That gives them a little extra
high on this
boost.
hill, in this area of Iowa, sometimes you might get a frost coming early in the season, or a frost coming in the harvest time earlier than
susceptible to winds. I mean, cold wind in the spring can be really tough too.
Yeah, so that use of black plastic is fairly common. And also a lot of people who produce more than just a few plants of squash in home gardens and on farm scale use different types of row covers. And that can be clear plastic with slits in it so that rain can percolate down through, and sunlight, direct sunlight comes through. But there's a product known as Remay, or it's a spun fiber. Sheets of this Remay can be placed, again, helping to protect the plant from
possible really cold snaps or
it
late
can
spring
help.
frosts.
But another thing that use of row covers helps with is protection from certain undesirable pests, insect pests in particular. The maxima types of squash are particularly susceptible to squash vine borer, which is actually a beautiful moth that looks a little bit like a wasp because it has clear underwings and a red body and white wings on top, but it burrows itself into the vines and can, in very susceptible varieties, the whole vine can collapse. Because this moth is laying its eggs, and then the larvae will crawl inside of the plant.
When we're looking at squash, I noticed in my garden, if I plant my zucchini too close to my crookneck, too close to my scallopini, I end up with some really funny looking squash. And I noticed Seed Savers is very careful, because this is obviously their business. You can see some of the squash out here have ties on them. Tell us a little bit about, you have a couple of examples here too of blossoms. Tell us why that happens, that sometimes our squash ends up looking a little funny, or even some of the winter squash that'll happen to as well.
Yeah, squash is a plant that has separate male and female flowers, and I'm showing examples of one of each. In my left, male flower, and in my right, a female. So what that means is that for pollen to fertilize and help produce the fruit, then bees or some other insect has to move the pollen to the female plant.
One blossom to the other.
Yep. And what that also means is that these plants can cross very readily with their neighbors if they're the same species.
Okay.
What we have in this field actually are representatives of several different squash species. The maxima that you're holding, but we also have Cucurbita moschata, which most people know as butternut, but we have a cheese type up there. Maxima and moschata don't intercross with each other.
Okay.
They're both squashes or pumpkins, but they're genetically unrelated or not closely related enough to produce the odd fruit you're talking about.
And when that happens, there isn't necessarily anything wrong with that fruit. You can still eat it.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of crossbreeding that's occurred in your garden.
The problem would occur next year if you saved your
Save
seed.
the seed. All right. Well, Laura, you are a wealth of information about squash. We probably could talk for hours about all the things that you could do with them. But thank you so much for sharing a few tips and explaining the difference of the kind of squash that most folks will find in their garden. We really appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you for coming here to Seed Savers.
Well, stay with us for more Garden Connections. We had such a great time with Laura. She knows so much about squash. That was really interesting. So this is your garden. It's called Diane's Garden. And I'm assuming many of these are plants that are favorites of yours.
They are, as I mentioned earlier, every seed has a story. So this garden is full of stories and seeds.
Now you've got a number of things in this garden, both flowers and vegetables. And is it generally just as easy to save seed from, say, something like this beautiful kale as it is the flowers that you have here?
Well, no, you've actually picked two of the opposite. I mean, this is probably one of the more difficult seeds to save, and that's one of the easiest because it's seeded itself. That's a night scented tobacco. I did not plant that there.
Oh,
so that, yeah, that just came there.
It said, here I am,
But
I'm gonna
yes,
live here.
yeah, and I thought, great, good for you. But the kale and a lot of the biennials, like the carrots and the kale, cabbages, you have to actually dig this plant, store it in the root cellar over the winter. It's not, you can do it, and then just then plant it out next spring, and then it goes to seed.
Okay,
So
2-year cycle.
Yeah, so there are every seed, you do have to know how your seed is pollinated and how it produces seed, and that's all about, experience and education.
Sure.
So like I said, all this information is on our website. It's not, yes.
Yeah.
But I always say for gardeners to start out with self-pollinating varieties like tomatoes, beans, peas, lettuce, because they will not easily cross with another.
Okay.
So that's a really
So you know
good,
you'll get the same type
Yes.
of peas the next year that you have
if
grown.
it's a non-hybrid.
Okay.
Yeah, you can't try. You'll get something with a hybrid, but it won't be that particular thing. It'll be
Good to know.
one of the parents of that plant. So to be a true seed saver, you want to have heirloom non-hybrid seeds. Start with something easy that you enjoy, and maybe that one that's been in your family, so you can also have a story to add to it.
Right.
Yeah, so I have everything in this garden. I have about 250 different plant types, so I like to combine flowers, herbs, prairie, vegetables all together, and they just work so nicely. They complement each other.
Diversity in the garden.
Yeah,
Yep.
and diversity, and you'll see that it attracts a lot of pollinators and butterflies and beneficial insects. The older varieties of flowers, I might add, also has more pollen and nectar, so they have more food for our pollinators.
Okay,
So that's
great. So
another
supports those in the
right.
garden,
It's
too.
another way to help our environment.
Great. You do so much here. We're going to come back and talk about a few other things that Seed Savers does as part of their organization here in Decorah. But we're now going to check out how to eat some of this food. Chef Stephen Larson has a recipe for us, this time with sweet potatoes. So let's check that out.
Hi, I'm Chef Stephen Larson. Welcome to my kitchen at Quarter Quarter Restaurant in Harmony, Minnesota. Today's recipe is going to use sweet potatoes. and in fact, he uses quite a lot of them. This calls for 4 pounds of sweet potatoes, and we have most of them already peeled and diced here in the bowl. But then I'm also going to show you an easy way to peel these. Now, sweet potatoes generally have pointed ends on the end, and it can be kind of difficult to peel. What I do is just cut those off with a knife and then use the peeler to go straight down. And take all of that off. Now, they can also be quite tough to cut, so I generally always recommend you do one cut on the side so that you've got a flat surface to work on, and then we'll do 2 more cuts that direction, and we'll cut it into more of a standard large dice. Now, you certainly don't have to be exact with this. As long as they get cut down into decent sized pieces, everything will be just fine. Okay, we'll add those to the bowl. And we're also going to use quite a lot of onion in there. This is a large sweet Vidalia onion that we want to cut in basically the same size as the potatoes. So that's done. Now, the preparation that I'm going to do is a Caribbean style roasted sweet potato. So that's going to be, ingredients will be onions, some vegetable oil. I like using grapeseed oil for my oil here. But we're also going to have a veritable cornucopia of spices that go in there to make it Caribbean style. We'll start off with some salt and sugar as our basic seasoning, but then we're also going to add 1.5 teaspoons of chopped fresh thyme, 1/2 teaspoon each of ground black pepper, cayenne pepper, and to make it very island-like, ground nutmeg, and also ground allspice. These are all going to go into the bowl. We're going to add our vegetable oil, 1/4 cup of that. And we'll toss that together so that everything gets well coated. Right, then on to a parchment-lined rimmed baking sheet. And we'll spread that all out so it's nice and even. Then into a 350-degree oven for about 45 minutes or so. So it's been 45 minutes, so we're going to pull our roasted sweet potatoes out now. Obviously, this recipe makes quite a lot. You can certainly cut it in half, though. I'm going to serve this on a plate as a side dish, along with a Jamaican-style grilled pork chop. So what I've done for that is to take a Jamaican jerk-style marinade, put it on the smoked pork, and then grilled that. So there we have it, Caribbean-style roasted sweet potato hash, because nothing's better than eating fresh from your garden.
As always, I get hungry every time I see the recipes that he creates. Chef Larson does a wonderful job, but we are back in Diane's garden with Diane Otwaley. She is the co-founder of Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah. Diane, we talked a lot about seed saving, and that's kind of your primary mission, but give me a list. You don't probably have enough fingers of all the other things that you have here for people to, they can actually come here and visit.
Right. Heritage Farm is open from March till the snow flies in December, and we have a lot of workshops and activities. So, you know, when the cooking part is probably one of my favorites, because to really understand what we're trying to do is to taste the diversity and the wonderful flavors of the heirloom varieties. So we have a tomato tasting in the fall, and that's a great one where you can sample 50 or 60 different kinds of tomatoes, you know, every color, size, shape, and form. We have seed saving workshops here, and that's very important because I think it's really important to see hands-on demonstrations on how to save seed. And then we have, you know, we're open to the public as I mentioned, and we have trails, and we have trout streams, and we also work with a rare breed of cattle. As I mentioned, with the introduction of hybrids, a lot of the non-hybrid seeds were falling out of favor. The same thing happened with livestock. So we're working with an endangered breed of cattle called the Ancient White Park. We're two places in the country where we're actually doing this work. And the same thing happened with poultry. So we have a display of rare heritage breeds. Just to, you know, it's so important to see what we're trying to save. And I think that Heritage Farm is diversity in action.
Yep, it's a beautiful place.
It's beautiful.
It's wonderful, and thank you for letting us come out. I would encourage anybody to come visit. It's a fantastic place. There's so much to see and do here, and you can pick up some of those wonderful seeds in the visitors center.
You can, and check the website for all the list of activities and that we offer here, and to get a free catalog, and just to find out more about what we're doing at Seed Savers Exchange.
Thank you so much for having us out.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this edition of Garden Connections. I'm your host, Stephanie Passingham, and we hope to see you next time.